Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming and welcome to our webinar. My name is Joy Banks, and I am the Executive Director of the Council of State Archivists. We are so glad that you have joined us for our second in a series of 3 webinars on tools and techniques for streamlining the transfer of agency records. Today's session, we will be diving into practical tools and techniques for transfer. CoSA is delighted to be partnering with Preservica on this webinar series. Preservica is our longtime sponsor of our SERI program, and we hope that this collaborative series will really be a practical and interactive exploration of the challenges and potential solutions for efficient and automated transfers of records. CoSA's mission is to provide leadership to strengthen and support state and territorial government archives leaders and staff in their work to preserve and provide access to government records. For nearly 15 years now, SERI has enabled us to take a particular interest in improving the management, preservation, and access to state and territorial government electronic records in our 56 member organizations. With swift advancements in technology and exponential growth in electronic records creation, government archives are really poised to lead the way in implementation of tools and techniques that continue efforts to document government, promote history, and secure our rights. Let me be the first to thank our moderator, Krista Barton, and our webinar planners, guest speakers, and our generous sponsor, Preservica, who made all of this possible. As our session goes along, we ask that you do use the chat to submit your questions, and we will do our best to answer them all at the end. And now I am delighted to pass this session over to Krista Barton from Preservica.
Hi everyone, my name is Krista Barton from Preservica. Thanks so much for having me. While I am going to share my screen to kick us off here. Here we go. So today's session, as Joy mentioned, we are focusing on practical tools and technology to transfer records from agencies and departments. And thank you for that great introduction, Joy. As many of you know, Preservica has been working with CoSA and SERI for many years now, so we're really happy and proud of all of the work that we've done throughout the years, and we're excited to share our stories with you today. Today is the second and our third part. Our next webinar coming up is August 28th, which will be talking about the impact of AI in transferring records from Teams and Outlook. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists today. We have a Vermont trifecta, I'd like to call. I was born and raised outside of Brattleboro, Vermont, so I am a Vermonter. Next, we have Rick Jerome from the Vermont State Archives and Records team. Rick, you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody. Excited to be here. Thanks, Krista.
All right, great. And next we have Nick Conzino, who is the head of systems and digital services at Norwich University in Vermont. Hi, Nick.
Hello, thank you for having me.
All right, great. So as today we mentioned, we're going to be talking about practical tools to transfer, tools and technologies to help you more seamlessly transfer your records, whether they are from state agencies, departments, and implementing that when you're transferring records. How do you also meet those goals of digital preservation? How do you do those transfers in an automated way using SharePoint? And both of our speakers today are going to be talking about those transfer processes and those strategies that they evaluated and how they are currently implementing them. So as I mentioned, next one up, our next webinar is set for Thursday, August 28th. I know that Joy and her team will be sending out more information, so you can all join us then. Also during that time, and I'm skipping ahead. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop sharing, and Rick, if you are up next.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me share my screen here. Okay.
And again, we ask everybody, while Rick is getting set up, we ask everybody to please put questions in your chat, in the chat area, and we will be going through them all at the end.
Awesome. So thanks again, Krista and Joy, and thanks everybody for showing up today. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit today about where digital preservation is going here in the state of Vermont. So first, I want to start off by sharing our three overarching digital preservation goals here at Vermont. Firstly, where we're going is we want to be able to automate the transfer and ingest of inactive born digital archival records. We also want to be able to preserve in place active born digital archival records. And we want to be able to integrate record keeping metadata for access and description. So when we're going through our digital preservation, we're trying to keep these three main goals in mind. And we've developed a number of information governance objectives and digital preservation objectives to work on this. So I'm not going to go through each one of these, but you can see for each information governance objective, right across, we have a corresponding digital preservation objective. We have frameworks at the top, then workflows, and how we want to be able to label libraries, folders, and records according to our record schedules, which are all based on Vermont statute and developed by our team in cooperation with the various agencies that the schedules are issued to. Next, we want to be able to automate, which is a big thing that we're talking about today, automate ongoing records appraisal. And we also are trying to focus on being able to automate moving and copying records labeled as archival into our digital preservation application. And lastly, one of our big objectives is to be able to apply our record keeping metadata based on the original application and be able to move it over to the preservation application as well. Okay. Now, here at the state of Vermont, we use Preservica for our digital archive, and it's called VT Retain. So we have some older records in our digital archive that have been digitized, but almost all of our records are born digital. That's where our main focus is. And currently we have almost 16 terabytes of records in our digital archive. So most of these have been brought in through manual process, and you can see why it's a big objective for us to be able to focus on trying to build a connector where we can get records in faster, easier, cut out some of the manual process, and especially be able to automate. So that is what we're looking for when we're looking at Preservica and the Preserve 365 application, which is what I'm going to be talking about. So Preservica came to us with Preserve 365 a number of years ago, and we partnered with them on a few different beta tests where we were working within a dev environment to test out the features and work collaboratively with them. We worked out a lot of bugs and kinks and a lot of back and forth about what makes the most sense for being able to transfer records through SharePoint into Preservica and into our digital archive. So recently we were able to set up a proof of concept where we could work in a real-time environment with a real instance of Preserve 365. And we were able to put it through a lot of testing, and we were impressed with what we saw so far. So this is what we're looking for from them, was our meeting our two main objectives, our information governance and our digital preservation objectives. So as I mentioned, Preserve 365 is an application that is embedded into Microsoft 365 SharePoint. So we set up the proof of concept, and we said that automating the transfer and preservation of digital state records placed as permanent archival from statewide systems and applications to the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, VSARA, is a cost-effective and time-saving approach for Vermont state government. The objective of the proof of concept pilot is to integrate the state of Vermont's Microsoft 365 tenant with VSARA's digital preservation system and digital state archives, called VT Retain. So here's a screenshot of one of our test document libraries. This is some records from the Human Services Board, their fair hearing decisions. Just a few records that we added to try to test out Preserve 365 and add metadata and see if we can get the connector to function as we expected from SharePoint into Preservica. So this slide here is a little video that I will play that kind of shows how it looks with all the different metadata columns. So you can see on the left here, we have some test lists, test libraries. This is our main test library that we'll be looking at today. And I'll play this and we can watch a little bit here. So the columns at the top, we'll look at this first record where it says fair hearing number, summary, department, issue. These are all metadata columns that we've created within this library. And we've been able to add the values to all these columns for all the different records. Now, this little P symbol that you see here that's blue is an indicator of the archive status. And this is from Preserve 365. So we have a couple of filled in blue Ps, which means that they've been archived. This one is not archived, it's not filled in. And we have one that's currently in the process of being archived. And it's about half filled in. So up here, there's the archive button. And that is what's added into SharePoint when you bring in Preserve 365. So clicking on that for an asset, it shows you this one has been archived. You can see it's got a Preservica ID right there. You can click View Asset, and it brings you right into a rendering of this asset in Preservica. So you can get there straight from SharePoint, and there it is. Looks just how it's supposed to look. And there's also a Properties tab here. And you can see right there, those are our SharePoint columns: fair hearing numbers, summary, department, program, issue, and those are the values that we put in on the side. So all those columns are automatically captured when you bring something over from SharePoint. And also, if we look down a little, there are some hidden fields and some empty fields. And there are a lot of empty fields that we haven't used at all, but you can see there's a lot of option for all sorts of metadata to come over from SharePoint. Here's another example. This is the one that's pending in process right there. So you can see the status right when you click on them. Now, here's one clicking on archive, something that hasn't been brought in yet. So this is what it looks like when you actually use Preserve 365 on an individual record, or it looks the same if you can use it on an entire library as well. So there's two choices. There's a copy, which creates a preserved copy in Preservica, but keeps the original in SharePoint. And then you can also move the item over, which preserves it in the archive and removes it from SharePoint. So one of the good things about this is that even if you use the move option, it moves the record completely over to Preservica, but it leaves a stub in SharePoint. And that stub is there. It can be searched for, clicked on, opened up. And when a user goes in and clicks on the stub, it opens up the record in Preservica without really forcing the user to leave their SharePoint environment. So this is really helpful for a lot of agencies that have records that they need to archive, but still might have active use. So they can continue to use their SharePoint site, their libraries, however they've set them up, without worrying about losing any of their access, or being forced to go into an entirely different system that they might not be familiar with. So this is what that first record that we were sort of looking at, that fair hearing decision. It's been ingested into Preservica now, and this is the backend of Preservica, the new generation, some of you might be familiar with. But this is a little preservation history tab that you can see, and it has file name, when it was preserved, file size, a bunch of technical metadata over here about the original document. It runs checksums for the integrity and authenticity of the records. And then there's some options for downloading. You can click on the history. It'll show you when it's been ingested, how it was ingested, whether it was through Preserve 365, and if it was, the metadata was changed. And then there is a render in SharePoint, which when you click on that, it shows you the document, just like how we saw before. So one of the reasons that SharePoint is so good for agencies to use and for this Preserve 365 tool is for the metadata. So in SharePoint, you can set up metadata columns like we saw. You have manage metadata columns, which can be mapped to existing term sets, or you can make local term sets for those. And you can also set up custom metadata columns, which can be lookup columns, or you can map them to term sets, controlled vocabularies, or free text. So this is a little example right here of a record that we could have in SharePoint. And this would be these would be the columns that we would use and the metadata that we would use. Maybe agency, domain, activity, record type, all these, and then we could add these values to them. We can have term sets for agencies, domains, and activities. We can have lookup columns for years, things like that. So we really want to try to use our metadata as much as we can and create a more flat structure in our digital archive so that people will be using metadata for searching, finding things, for access, instead of a folder structure, which is not as effective digging down into folders. So this is a big thing for us here. We want to make sure that our metadata that we create in our SharePoint libraries right here, when we use Preserve 365, it captures all that metadata, all those columns, all those values, and brings them right over into VT Retain Preservica in the same way, looking the same, so that people can use those. And so that agencies, when they're using SharePoint, can set up their columns, set up their metadata. They can have a number of columns already pre-filled out. If they know their agency is always going to be the same, if they're using a document library for their decisions, they know their record type is going to be decisions. They can always have that the same. And a number of other things too. And then maybe they only have to enter a few things like a title or a date, making it very easy. And then once Preserve 365 can grab those, bring them over, all that will be preserved. So we sort of saw this already. This is the render SharePoint view with properties. So you can see a little closer here. This, again, we're seeing the same metadata values and fields right here. So this is good. This is what we're trying to achieve, but it's not exactly what we're trying to achieve. I'll show you here. This is a little view of VT Retain. So this is the public portal where you can see we have some approved dental minutes from the Board of Dental Examiners. And this is actually the record that had the metadata that I was showing you a minute before in those, the orange box and the blue box right there. So we see we have this blue rectangle right here that has the metadata. We have our agency, dental examiners, board of, domain, activity, record type. It's the same things we already saw. So this is, this was not brought over from Preserve 365. This was ingested manually. So this is our custom metadata schema that you're seeing in action here, which is called VT Core. It's based off Dublin Core. So this is our goal here, is we need the metadata that comes over from SharePoint to translate to actually come directly into our schema, our VT Core. So this leads me into the first of our next steps here. So far, oh, excuse me. So far, in our testing of Preserve 365, we managed to get all the values in the columns over as we want, but we still need to implement metadata crosswalk to bring those metadata values into our VT Core schema. Currently, they populate as Office 365 metadata because they're just gathered from those columns. So we're working with Preservica right now, and they have this in development to be able to take an agency's or actual custom metadata schema and bring the data directly into it. This is going to be very, very helpful for us. One of our next steps is we're looking at not only SharePoint libraries, but SharePoint lists as well. So everything I showed before, the SharePoint view, that was all in a library with distinct records within that library. But we also need to be able to bring over lists with Preserve 365. And currently, it will ingest lists, but they come over as like one folder. The list is a folder, and then each list item is an individual record within it. What we're looking for, if we think about lists, they can have thousands of items in them, is to be able to ingest a list as a single record that retains all the functionality of SharePoint list. So a user can go in, maybe go in through SharePoint, click on a stub of a list, or go in through VT Retain and find the list and be able to use it exactly as, see it and use it exactly as they would if they were within SharePoint in the native environment. Next step, we're looking for, I think it was already mentioned that Microsoft Outlook is one of the next things coming for Preserve 365, which is really exciting for us to be able to see how that will function as well. And currently we're working here at Basar with our Public Utility Commission and Public Service Board on it. They're they're looking to implement a new case management system. And once this is in place, we're going to be interested in integrating Preservica and Preserve 365 into the case management system at some point in the future to be able to capture those automatically. And speaking of automation, one of the things that we struggled with a little bit in this proof of concept was the automation part. So Microsoft Purview is something that we're trying to leverage for further automation, the retention and disposition of records within SharePoint. We were not quite able to use Purview in the proof of concept. We have to work with our agency of digital services to do that. But we are looking to use policies, file plans, and the labels for automation, which I'll show you a little bit in the next slide how that will work. But the idea is you can set up a label and it will be applied to an entire library or list, and you can set it to automatically have a retention policy. Maybe it's 3 years, then send to archives, and it will run on that entire library and everything in it. And also with Purview, we have been working a lot with sensitivity labels for documents, Microsoft 365. And we are currently working with Preservica to create a crosswalk between the sensitivity labels and the security tags in Preservica. So if something is labeled as a document is labeled as exempt, when it's ingested through Preserve 365, that will read the sensitivity label and automatically apply the security tag of exempt within VT retain. And that will make it not viewable to the user. So I have another video here, which I'll start, which is going to show once that the labeling is set up within Purview, this will show you how it works within Preserve 365. So in the library settings, the sensitivity labels are right there. You can set a sensitivity label for an entire library here. And you can see there are some generic ones on top there, and then a bunch that have been created in the testing with Microsoft Purview. But these can be set exempt, review, general for an entire library. Then the more settings, you can apply a label to the items in this list or library. And we have a couple of test labels here too, but this is what I was just talking about. This is where you can set up a label to run whatever sort of retention is appropriate for that library. And this will require setting up libraries for like records if you want to use the retention labeling system, so that agencies can put their records into a library that they know everything going into this library has a retention of 3 years, then archive, or whatever it is. And that will automatically run for all those records and apply it to retroactively. And then when you look at an individual record in the details, both of these things are also here. So there's a sensitivity label right there, the same labels you can apply to individual records, or when you apply it to a library, it'll show up there. And also here are the labels. So if there's a label on an entire library, it'll show up there, or you can do it manually for each individual record. So this will really help to give specific agencies, then the records officers in the agencies, more control, give them a little more ownership over their records management, and be able to use libraries that have been set up for specific records, and without that manual intervention they'll be able to put records into SharePoint libraries, set some metadata on them, have other metadata already populated, and then those libraries will run the retention through Microsoft Purview and through the use of those labels automatically. So that's what we've been looking for at this with this proof of concept with Microsoft Preserve 365. If we look back at our 3 goals here, it really hits on all of them. The automation, which I've just been talking about, of all these born digital records, that will be really helpful for us. The idea that using Preservica and agencies being able to use their Preservica or their SharePoint libraries as they've been using them for any active records, and even once they transfer them over to Preservica, having those stubs in place that they can still go back and use their records how they need to. And then the metadata piece, especially once we get our crosswalk for our specific custom VT core schema, is really going to be a game changer for us and bring all 3 of our goals together with Preserve 365. So we're really excited to see where this moves forward in the future. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Rick. Again, keep the questions coming and we will answer them all at the end. Next, we're going to pass it over to Nick.
Okay, thank you very much. Just let me get loaded here 1 second.
Oh, Nick?
Yes, I'm
Are
still
you
here.
with us, Nick?
Yep.
Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yep, I'm still here. Thank you.
Yep. There you go.
Okay. Okay, thank you everybody for having me. My name is Nick Canizzo. I'm the head of systems and digital services for the Library, Archives, and Museum at Norwich University in Northfield, Vermont. I've worked with CoSA for a long time. I've worked with Preservica before, so I'm thankful to both of them for allowing me to come and speak with you all today. I'm going to talk a lot about some similar stuff that Rick talked about, but I'm going to do more of a your 10,000-foot view, how we look at and can evaluate digital transfer technology tools, systems, things like that as they can get incorporated into your transfer process. What you will hear me talk about today are our goals, our requirements, what our priorities are, some best practices. What you're not going to hear me talk about are specific tools and technologies, because truth is those are really going to have to be determined by your specific situations, especially the way your laws are written, the way your agency relationships are, the way your record schedules are. There's too much variability in those things for me to be able to say this or that is the right tool for you. But what I'm going to try to do is equip you with the skills that you can use to select those tools for yourself. There's no right answer, but there are a lot of wrong answers, I think. But we'll see about that as we get through. So you've heard about me. Many of you probably have seen me before. I've given a number of webinars for CoSA and Preservica before. But the one I wanted to highlight the most is the Move It project, which is modeling viable electronic information transfers, a report that was sponsored by Preservica and CoSA, and which deals exactly with this topic. You can find it in the CoSA Resource Center. And it kind of talks about a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today with a little bit more detail, and reviews some projects. I think there were 6 successful projects that had been done of various sizes with a number of states throughout the US, and it kind of gives you some good context for what we're talking about. So what I'm going to start with are some, kind of an overview of what our goals might be for affecting a digital records transfer. I'll talk about the process in depth. I think it's most effective to look at the individual details and the transactions that take place during the transfer process in order to best be able to say what technology we need to support those, and then a couple of strategies at the end for evaluating those technologies. If you have any questions during any of this time, feel free to throw them in the chat. Although I can't see it right now, I will try to answer them at the end. So the first thing I wanted to say before I got started is hopefully everyone here, or many of you, are familiar with both with the OAIS, the Open Archival Information System reference model. It's an ISO standard 14721, just in case you're interested, but it's an internationally recognized and accepted standard for talking about how a digital archives works. As a companion to that student, I recommend, if you haven't, take a look at the PAIS or PAIMAS. This is the Producer Archives Interface Specification, or the methodology abstract specification. These specifically define the nature of the relationship between the records producer and the archives at a pretty much as a mind-numbingly technical and detailed level that I'm going to try to reduce into like 2 slides today. But I recommend you read them both thoroughly in your spare time, because they are really critical for understanding all the different moving parts that really have to go right in order for these transfers to be successful. I know that Preservica's tools were built on these standards. I know that a lot of the tools that are out there are thinking about these standards, and therefore you should be as well. And I already talked about the movement report, so take a look at that too when you get a chance. So just at a high level, I'm thinking about when I'm doing a transfer, when I'm receiving a transfer as a digital archivist, what I think about are kind of these 4 major things. One is that pretty obviously we want to guarantee the integrity of the data, both before, after, and during the transit. What that really means is we don't want any data to be lost. There's a lot of people potentially that could be involved in this process, potentially a lot of steps, and potentially a lot of different tools. And anytime data is being copied or moved or transformed in any way, there's an opportunity for data loss. We want to try to avoid that as much as possible, especially in government contexts in which inadvertent or unauthorized destruction of data is actually illegal. So not only do we want to preserve the content, whatever those records, the information contained within those records, but we need to preserve the context as much as possible. Archives and archival records are about context, and that includes the traditional context that we usually think of. So who's the creator? What's the date of the creation? What's the statutory authority? What's the function, or the process that the records were used in? But we also want to be thinking about the technical context. What's the operating system that the user was using? What software did they use to create the records? Where did the records live during their time as an active or inactive record? What tools connected to those storage repositories and transformed or modified those records in any way? Depending on the nature of the record, depending on the nature of the information, that could be essential information that needs to be retained as well. So we can't always just say, I just want the PDF, that's good to go, and then I'm done. Even saying I want the PDF and the metadata associated might not be enough, because we don't even know necessarily where all that metadata might be. We also need to protect sensitive information, so any information that's protected by law against unauthorized disclosure, so your PII, PHI, trade secrets, that kind of stuff. And then lastly, we want to eliminate as much as possible any unnecessary multiplication of data. We've all been in a situation before in which somebody transferred records to us, and maybe they gave us a copy and they kept their own copy. And then I can tell you for a fact, 2 years later, when that person retires, somebody hands you their hard drive and now you have 2 copies of records. Sometimes that can happen 2, 3, 10, 20 times. What is the actual original source of truth? What is the true version of the record, and which ones are just derivatives? Those are the kind of situations we want to avoid. So we want to ensure that during any transfer process, there aren't fragments of data or sets of records that are just proliferating wildly and just kind of out there. And of course, the hidden 5th objective here is that we want to do this as efficiently as possible. It's not like the archives are overflowing with funding or staff or time to be able to do this stuff. So we need to prioritize getting it done. Because if we can't do all of these things and still get it done, then it's not going to get done. So this is a big, long list, kind of derived from the PAIS model. I'm going to tip my hat to Lori Ashley. I worked on a presentation with her of similar kind. She came up with a lot of this list. I've modified it a little bit. I put the question marks in there because, we can look at the responsibilities of the producer in the archives, and we can try to assign some of the necessary steps to one or the other. But the honest truth is that, and again, if once you do this work for a few months, you'll know that the transfer is an agreement, it's a negotiation, and it's a collaboration. You can't get this done without the records producer's buy-in, just like they can't get it done without your buy-in. So who does what? We like to say, and we would love to have a hard and fast model that says, oh, you all do this and we all do this. But in actuality, they're operating under the same restrictions that some of us are. Some of our producer agencies are even smaller than the archives and even have less budget and have fewer staff resources and less time available or worse technology than us. And then others might have quite a bit more. So we sometimes have more of the junior partner role and sometimes have more of the senior partner role and sometimes have more of the teacher role and sometimes have more of the technical expert role, and we have to be flexible. So these might be the things that need to be done, but that's all going to kind of shake out in the process of that collaboration. So I threw in a graphic. I'm not really graphically inclined, but I threw in this picture from the PAS model, this really wonderful overview that they've provided for us for what the transfer process looks like. But really, it kind of comes down to these major steps, which is, kind of figure out what needs to be transferred, work with, have the two entities, the producer and the archives, come together in order to define what kind of the details, effect the transfer, and then confirm that everything happened correctly. We kind of looked at this when we did the Move It project, and I put it in a little bit more plainer language. Really what we're talking about is kind of an initiation process, first contact plus an agreement of what's going to be transferred and how, a packaging process in which the records custodian, the producer, kind of gets the records ready to be transferred. That third step is that transfer, that physical exchange of data. Then there's the fourth step, which is the verification of that exchange by the archives, making sure that no data was lost or adversely affected during the transfer, and also that we've met all the parameters of the agreement that we've previously worked on. And then lastly, a finalization, which is that's really where I usually think of that final transfer of intellectual custody from when the record goes from agency custody to the archives custody. So I'm going to dig deeper on a few of these sections, because picking this process apart is kind of what will tell you what the tools you need. We would love, in many, many cases, for there to be a one-size-fits-all tool that could do this process for every system out there and for every kind of record out there, but that's not really realistic. The development and the pace of how government agencies, public agencies especially, are implementing their technology means we're always going to be a little bit behind where they are, kind of trailing behind the bus. So there's not ever going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. Kudos to Preservica for making one that is pretty universal for working with SharePoint, but that's only part of the picture, right? There's a lot of other tools that are out there, despite whether we want them to be or not. So during this initiation process, really this is when we're talking about figuring out what records are eligible to be transferred, whether by schedule or by law, statute, what the characteristics and classifications for those records are, what their structure is, and then how much of it there are. So you might consider the volume to be the scope or the extent of the transfer, but really we're talking about what is it? What is it that we're transferring? This is the part where the archives and the producer really need to get together and come up with an agreement for what will be covered, because if that step doesn't happen, there's going to be friction and there's going to be mistakes. We need to be really clear about where the data is, what is being extracted or being selected to come along, who's going to do it, and how it's going to get done. This is also the time to start thinking about that legal instrumentation. So if there is a transfer agreement or an assignment of authority or an assignment of custody, a custody receipt or exchange form, whatever your state or territory might have, or if you're outside of state or territorial government, whatever process you might have in your jurisdiction, you got to think about that stuff now, because again, we want to make sure everybody's on the same page at the beginning. And the PAIS model includes what they call this formal definition, these elements that make part of that agreement. Well, the agreement itself doesn't need to be formal. We need to be thinking about what the data is, how it's structured, and then how we're going to kind of do it in the future. The technology you want to think about during this initiation process, it doesn't have to be in depth, but this is where you want to be thinking about the system in which the records reside today. So what your source system is, and just, we need to keep in the back of our mind that the system in which the records are stored now is not necessarily the system that created them. A lot of the records we have in government aren't created by the government. They come because they're submitted by members of the public or citizens, whether they're in legal proceedings or whether they're in land transactions or whatever they might be. So we need to consider how much of that original system information we need to be capturing, because the context of that system itself is essential, almost as essential as the content within the record itself. Why? Because different versions of different systems are able to do different things. Different versions of different records might contain different amounts of information. And if you're trying to understand how government works through records, you want to have as much of that context as possible. Moving to the selection phase, kind of picking out those records, after we've kind of had our agreement, figuring out how to extract those from that source system and then package them up into essentially what is going to become your SIP, your submission information package, what's going to be ingested into the archives. This is kind of where the complexity starts to go up, so to speak. We want to be making sure that we're capturing the record itself. Let's take an unstructured document like a Word document or a PDF. We want to make sure we have the ability to identify what the record is. We want the metadata from the file system or the records management system that it's in. And we maybe want to capture information about who created it. What contextual linkage do those PDFs have to other documents, right? Are there hyperlinks within? Is it pages of a book? Is it a component of a larger set? We want to be able to figure out during this process, because you'll see that we're not really going to have another time for it, where the sensitive or protection information is. Is it in the same place on every single record, or is it in an arbitrary or different place? Is there a structure to the way the records are created and formed, or is it just arbitrary, right? Is it the difference between a form versus just kind of free text? This is a place where a lot of technology can be really useful. Any technology that can rapidly process and evaluate data, such as something that can search for a dictionary of protected or sensitive terms. For example, if you have protected health information, you may want to be searching for health-related terms related to the healthcare domain. That will clue you in that, well, maybe there is PHI in there. Also during this time, any tool that can label or classify our records that can aid in the transfer process or kind of aid in the descriptive process down the road, this is a great time to do it. Because again, this is kind of the last time that you're going to have the agency being able to put their input, right? Because once they transfer the records to the archives, they're pretty much done with them. And then lastly, if transformations need to be made, this is the time that we need to be thinking about that. So a good example of a transformation would be any type of structured database that exists that possesses a huge amount of data. So think like your state healthcare systems, or maybe there is a land records registry, or maybe there is a vital records kind of registry. You might be talking about a database that has dozens or hundreds of data elements. What does the data look like when it comes out of that system? Is it just a selection of those data elements that's going to be transferred? Is it all of them? How are those, how do you turn a database table into a PDF? There might be custom views that are already created by the agency that they use. There might not be. So this is the time to be thinking about, are we going to have to transform or modify the data in any way just to get it to us, because we can't take the entire thing. And this is when we talk about extraction, kind of mapping the data from an arbitrary system into a structure that our repository can understand. And might be limited by what the repository can understand, but you also might be limited by what the original data source can do. I can think of these kind of most commonly, again, in that kind of structured data thing that I was mentioning earlier, but there's a lot of different contexts in which we need to extract data from a system and transform it in such a way that we can continue to use it in the future. Another one that might be familiar to everyone is the use of a proprietary system that has a license or authentication required, any digital rights management. Those are the types of details that might necessitate, well, we can't use Microsoft format for this because we're not going to have Microsoft in the future. Well, Microsoft's a terrible example because you could. We can't use company X's software because we have a license and that's expiring and the server's being shut down. So we need to migrate it to an open format. Those are the types of things that you need to do now, not back. We want to try to avoid doing those later, because this is the only time you're going to have access to that raw data out of the system. Because if everything goes right, a lot of it's going to be deleted. And what we're talking about here at the high level are looking at arbitrary systems, whatever could be out there. When I got to Norwich, there were like 250 different unique systems that were in use on campus. And this is a campus with about 4,000 students. So if you think about state government, you might be talking dozens or hundreds of agencies. Each of those agencies might have a dozen different systems. There are the big fish, your SharePoint, your OneDrive, your OnBase, your kind of records management systems that everybody uses. But then there are others that are custom. State government has especially a lot of custom software built for very specific functions. We need to be thinking about tools that can apply to those arbitrary systems. Furthermore, we need to be making sure at this point, this is kind of our first check-in, that we're making sure that we're actually verifying the data that's coming out. When the data comes out of the system, but before it goes to the archives, it's a great point to create some fixity. That's a great point to be able to create a snapshot of the data that we can compare against later. Because again, this is kind of your first step into all the data is moving. And so this is where it can go wrong. So I am very much in favor of creating snapshots along the way, just to make sure when we get to the archives and we're in our, in the digital archives 5 years from now and the file is corrupt, we can say, where did it go wrong? Hopefully we don't find it 5 years from now. Hopefully we find it during this process, but if we don't, we can't. And this is this is kind of the process where transformations, you're not going to be one for one. That's kind of the whole point of the transformations. You're changing it from something into another. That's when data loss can happen. And the things we need to be considering during this process of transformation is, what's the user experience like? What kind of data do we have available to us when we make decisions? What kind of connections exist between our different data elements? Preserving that context is truly essential. And if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to provide what we need to our constituents. Talking about the next step, the transfer step, this is actually, I don't want to say this is the easiest or straightforward, but this is kind of like when, somebody hands you the hard drive, that's the transfer. Really, most of the work in my view happens during the selection, extraction and or transformation process. After the transfer, this is kind of just like the physical exchange of data. Hopefully, I know I used the example of a hard drive. Hopefully you're not doing that. Hopefully you're doing it through some kind of internal network. And this is the time where you want to be able to validate the data before, make the transfer, validate the data after, because data in movement is data that could be lost. So the technology we're looking for here are, there's a bunch of open source tools that are available. There's a bunch of proprietary tools that are available that can read file systems and be able to print out the metadata that's contained within. There are a bunch of tools available that can process data in common formats, such as PDFs, .docs, PowerPoint presentations, MP4s, MP3s, JPEGs, etc., and be able to pull out EXIF metadata or any type of arbitrary metadata that might be contained within. And then lastly, we always want to be thinking about, can we identify the files that are coming to us? Because we don't want to lose sight of the fact that the people who are transferring records to us might not be the people who created those records, because we are the archives. We are talking about records that may have been created quite a bit of time ago. So how many of us have gotten records from records producers because they're cleaning out an old server or cleaning out a drawer or a filing cabinet and they don't know what they are, but they know that they're archival. So that might happen as well. So we need to be able to pull out some information about those records. After we get everything, we want to make sure that we validate what we've gotten to make sure no data was lost, to make sure that we've gotten everything we're supposed to get, and moreover, that we didn't get anything that we're not supposed to get. Again, that can be a real problem for us down the road if we ingest items into the archives that shouldn't be there, especially things that are not official, that are informal, things that have PII that's not identified, and so on and so forth. This is the point, I think, where once we have verified receipt, we want to be talking about whether those copies are destroyed, which one is the permanent record and which one is the derivative. We want to make sure that, especially for the government context down the road, there is no question about the authenticity of the record. We have to assume that our records are going to be used in legal proceedings, and we don't want there to be a record at the Attorney General's office, at the Department of Corrections, at the state police, and in the archives, 4 different versions of the same record that say different things. That's a disaster for the state. So we want to make sure that that's not happening here. We want to make sure that there is one official version, and that everybody else is pointing to it and knows where it is. So we're looking at similar tools to what we're doing with extraction. We've generated fixity before, so now we want to be able to confirm the fixity. We have validated our files before, or we've created some metadata about the files before. We want to be able to validate that metadata. And the truth is here, we don't want to get too complicated. We want to do things very similarly to what we did in a previous step, because that'll just be easiest for everyone. This should all have been defined ahead of time anyway. And then we have our closeout, which I didn't make a slide for, but really that's kind of the last step, which usually is the final sign off and the transfer of intellectual custody. In the paper records context, we usually have a form that says, okay, well, this is ours now. That's really important, again, for that authenticity piece. We want to be able to make sure that we know what is the official version of the record. So that's the process. I have a couple slides on the evaluation criteria. I'll run through them really quickly because I know we're getting to the end and there are some questions. But really what we're looking at, again, we could have a whole session on this, but we want to make sure that our tools are interoperable. We want to make sure that they work on a variety of different systems, because the last thing we want to have is 50 tools for 50 systems. Ideally, like I said, I don't think you're ever going to get just one that works on everything the state uses, but I think it is likely that we can get a handful that can apply to a bunch of different circumstances. So we can have a tool that takes structured data from a SQL database and transforms it into X, whatever we need it to be. There's a lot of context for that, because the truth is there are a lot of different flavors of applications that are out there, but most of them are built on very similar technologies and very similar structures. Very important for the archives is the ability to audit our tools. We don't want to trust, let me put this in a different way. We want to be able to make sure that we can trust that when a tool tells us that data has been verified or that a job has been done, it actually has been done. We don't want to ever have to look down the line, again, looking back 5 years later and say, the tool that I used to copy data didn't actually copy everything correctly and cut off after 100,000 characters. Stuff like that has happened before in archival contexts, and we need to be testing this stuff out ahead of time. We want to make sure it's secure. Obviously, we're dealing with data that is protected and sensitive, so we want to be absolutely making sure that no data is leaking, especially if we're talking about online cloud-based tools, that there's nobody listening on our transfers. We want to make sure it's as secure as possible, and it's a nice bonus if it can help us identify where that data is. And then lastly, obviously, we want to be mindful of the cost, not just the kind of sticker price, but also how much time it takes to use. A tool that is really cheap but takes thousands of hours of state staff time to use is actually less cost effective than a tool that maybe has a bigger sticker price but is automatic. So those are things we do need to be thinking about, and we want to think, long term, because we're the archives. We think long term. We're thinking about sustainability. We want to be thinking about all those factors when we're choosing our software, and when we're actually implementing them, we need to be thinking about those things as well. So I put interoperability again because I'm not thinking about how the data tool extracts data from a system, but how many of us have worked with our statewide or our jurisdiction-wide IT and just found that we don't have access to Linux workstations, though, so any Linux-based tool is out. We have to live in a Microsoft Windows 11 environment, so the tool has to be compatible with Windows 11. And then there's a bunch of other security requirements our states might have. So we need to not only be thinking about getting the data out of the source system, but just can we run it on the workstations that we have? We want our tools to be repeatable, so we don't want to have to reinvent the wheel every single time we do a transfer. We'd like for them to be repeatable as much as possible in consistent ways. Furthermore, we would like a transfer of the same data to be affected and look the same way every time. If you run the same test on the same data multiple times and you get different outputs, that's a clue that the tool is not working in the way we need it to. We talked about staff resources already, but I did want to just emphasize that when we're thinking about how these tools work, we're not just thinking about archival staff time, but the records managers, the records producers, the administrative assistants, the legal counsel, the IT folks, the kind of line of business folks who are out there at the public agencies. They need to understand how these tools work. They sometimes need to be able to install and operate them on their own without our assistance. So a tool that makes sense to us and works for us as technical experts, theoretically, might not work out at an agency, especially depending on what we're asking them to do. And that's why that last piece, the cooperation, is so important. We have to have those agreements defined. We have to have all of this known ahead of time so that we can say, agency staffer is going to do this, archives is going to do this, then the stat agency is going to do this, then the archives is going to do this, and then IT is going to do this. If we don't have that worked out ahead of time, we're going to get into a situation where people don't know what to do, or people do the wrong thing, or multiple people do the same thing, and then that's confusion in the process. We can deal with that when it's a few dozen gigabytes that are being transferred, but once, as Rick was saying, once you get into the level of terabytes being transferred at a time, multiple agencies being involved, then it starts to get very complicated. So that's kind of a blitz of everything. Look at the movie report. Feel free to contact me. There's a lot more to this topic than I think we even had time for. So, it's not solved. We only have strategies and we have approaches. We don't necessarily always have solutions. And that's what's kind of fun about the work we do, is that everything is changing and we're always looking to improve what we're doing. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Nick. And thank you, Rick, for both of you for presenting today. I know that we are over time. Joy, can we stay on to answer a couple of questions? If people have a few more minutes, we're happy to stay on. Or we can also kind of send out some written responses to people's questions.
Yeah, we can go ahead and respond, and then we'll get them on the recording.
Okay, great. So I actually wanted to start with a question and this is for Rick. As part of your proof of concept and pilot, how did you decide kind of which agency, and how did you decide what agency would be a best fit for a pilot to work in that project?
Yeah, so it basically came down to the agencies that are farthest along in the in their implementation and use of SharePoint for their records, like the most mature basically agencies in using Microsoft 365. So our Agency of Human Services is one of our farther along agencies. So we decided to partner with them because they already have their records set up in SharePoint. They have libraries, they have lists, and the specific records we used are open to the public. It's a defined set, so it was something easy that we could use as a group, basically.
Great, thank you. And also I had a question for Nick, if it's okay if I can ask another one here, is Nick, we hear kind of consistently from our clients that some of the they have challenges getting records either from their agencies, their departments, we all kind of know those. And a lot of times they say I hear this question repeatedly, how do you educate those teams about, what they need to send you, when and how? Like any advice on the education process that's involved in transferring records?
Yeah, so I have two thoughts about that. One is I think the thing that, from my experience and with and in government, we always want to emphasize the legal aspect of things as much as possible. We don't want to talk necessarily about, if you don't do this, you're breaking the law, but compliance is easier if you have your information organized. That can't really be said more simply than that. Everything you do will be more efficient, especially from a regulatory compliance perspective. If you know where all your data is, it's properly classified, it's properly labeled, and you can move it through the records lifecycle as efficiently as possible. But the other thing, I think that I've heard a lot is there's a lot of reluctance to transfer records because we still might need them. You know what I mean? Like we still might need them today. And what I don't want is to transfer a record to the archives and then I'm going to need it next week because I have a case or because I have an application or a permit or whatever, and I don't have access to it. So in some ways we can alleviate those concerns by something like the Preserve 365 tool, or any tool that can bring records from inactive environment into an archives environment and make them available right away. The more we can automate those processes, we can say it is actually seamless. Yes, it might not be in your system anymore, but it's here and we can provide you to a link to it immediately and you have access to it immediately so that there is no interruption to your service. Where we get bogged down is when the systems don't interact correctly or we haven't defined those agreements in the right way. There's long processing times or there's long delays in the transfer and that access is interrupted. I think allaying those concerns as much as possible will kind of alleviate a lot of the problems because, we want to keep our stuff that we worked on because we might need it, and I respect that. But the number of times that I've been working with a producer agency, whether it's in the university or kind of out in government, where they don't want to be able to do that because of that worry. I respect that. I understand. And a lot of the times we feel that once the records are out of our control, who knows what can happen to them, right? I might not have them anymore. But those are the types of things that we need to be able to show, and that's why having a nice efficient process and a nice transparent and auditable process, we can show them doesn't get changed, doesn't get lost, doesn't get damaged. And by the way, we're preserving all the metadata that you have. So if you need to find it by your case number or your unique ID system or whatever it might be, we're keeping that. So you can find it. You just have to go to our site instead of your site. That's all. And the more seamless we can make that in the future, the better. I think everyone will be happier.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick. Did you two have any questions for each other? I know that we've answered a number of the questions in the chat already. We will be sending out copies of the slide decks and recordings. I think we answered a couple of the questions already. One question from Bethany was about, is there a file or folder size limit with our SharePoint Preserve 365 ingest process? And the answer is no. Then Patricia asked, do we have to create custom metadata schemas or transform files? And I know that Rick answered that right within the presentation already. And yes, you do. But do you guys have any questions for each other or any other remaining questions before we wrap up?
I have a quick question for you, Rick. And it might be more of a general question for Preservica as well. So when you're linking in your video, you showed there's a connection to a SharePoint list or library. After the record has been, archived or ingested into Preservica, can the agency still change anything about that record, and what happens if they do?
No, once it's ingested, that is the permanent record that gets brought into Preservica. So yeah, there wouldn't be any way for them to change that afterwards, which is definitely what we want for archival records, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. So does it still appear to them in their library as could they access the record from their library, or do they have to go into your Preservica instance in order to actually get access to that?
So they can definitely access it through SharePoint.
Yep.
Like when it has the stub, they can click on it and they can see the record there. But that actually brings them to the Preservica site, so they'll see that.
Oh, okay.
And that's for the move. For the copy, we won't probably be using the copy because when there's archival records, we don't want another copy somewhere else, as you know.
Exactly.
So I think that might be more for commercial, businesses and things that might need the copy, not really for an archive like us.
Great.
And we find that our clients that want to use the copy function it's because they want to give more access to their end users, because they can access it right within SharePoint and not leave it and go over to Preservica. And so they tend to be not necessarily permanent records. They tend to be long-term records, but within that shorter window where they're going to be more easily accessed.
Makes sense.
All right, great. So I know that we've run a few minutes over, and I want to thank everybody for their time. As we mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, that we are starting our beta in user groups access groups for a new product that's coming out, which is archiving through Microsoft 365 of Outlook. So if you haven't received it already, we are sending out emails inviting people to join those groups if they want to be part of that testing process and help really define some of the upcoming features that when we release that product that are coming up. So again, thank you for everyone. And I am just going to share how you can get in touch with us. I'm going to share my screen here one last time so everybody can see. If you have additional questions, please reach out to the teams at CoSA, SERI, or Preservica, and we will be happy to get you some more information. So you see here some information at Preservica and at SERI at statearchivist.org. So again, we thank you everybody for your time, and we are looking forward to the next meeting in August. Take care.